Thanks for joining us in our chilly room here today. So I'm going to start off by situating my pseudo paper here as part of an ongoing practices research endeavor. So I'm not sure if anybody here is familiar with PAR, practices research, but it's kind of a strain in performance studies that situates practitioners not only critically reflecting on their practice and creative artistic endeavors, but also using that as kind of an arena of critical intervention itself. So as an exotic dancer, I've been trying to critically reflect on my own practice and deal with some of these questions that I'm often, that are thrown at me about issues of empowerment and what does it mean to be in burlesque and these kinds of things. So what I'm going to present today is kind of my ongoing theoretical musings in the form of a kind of Socratic dialogue with myself. So this is the beginning of a project. Really, I'm just looking to have a conversation. So buckle up and enjoy. Feel free to ask me greater questions beyond the dry theory stuff in the question period. Starting from Sedgwick's understanding of sexuality is neither wholly outside the realm of power nor wholly circumscribed by it, but as kind of tending to represent, quote, the full spectrum of positions between the most intimate and the most social, the most predetermined and the most aleatory, the most physically rooted and the most symbolically infused, the most innate and the most learned, the most autonomous and the most relational traits of being. I'm kind of extrapolating this notion to questions about interiority and exteriority, and kind of ideas of the subject and object binary. So, although it's impossible to declare any kind of authentic version of the sexual self, sexuality seems to convey elements of subjecthood where sexiness has often been equated with more of an object status. Rosalind Gill talks about and suggests that there's this existing a new femininity that's organized around sexual confidence and autonomy, and that the resulting tension is a struggle between sexual subjectification and objectification. So my question is, are the two mutually exclusive? Or is it possible for a woman to take pleasure or access a position of power through positioning herself as an object? At this point, I turn to the unique position of the neo-burlesque dancer, who's kind of simultaneously navigating this terrain. And I'd like to touch on notions of commodification and fetishism by way of Freud and Marx, and kind of establish a notion of erotic capital that might be useful for describing female flesh under capitalism. So first off, when the female body is the site of sexual performance, where is the line drawn between the exercise of ownership and commodification? And there seems to exist kind of a chasm between the desire to be both the object of desire and sexual gaze and the subject of this gaze. So my question is, can sexualized performances of the female body, which constitute neo-burlesque, navigate some kind of area in between, something beyond subject and object? So short description of neo-burlesque. Burlesque is a performance form which blends overt sexual display with comedy and satire, very popular in vaudeville, 20s to 40s. It's historically been both powerfully subversive and at the same time exploitative of female sexuality. And I'm wondering what the contemporary rejuvenation of the form can reveal about the current role of sexual performance in a feminist context. Jackie Wilson, who is a scholar on the topic, attributes this mainstream revival to an as-to-yet undefined structure of feeling, or unarticulated pre-emergence, which has seen female sexuality become positioned alongside radical social potential. So burlesque has been, quote, a testing ground that pushed and crossed boundaries aesthetically, culturally, and politically. So if the neo-burlesque performer is the physical embodiment of this emerging social environment, what are the characteristics of this period which have necessitated her resurgence? So I would suggest that a lot of this has to do with a newfound interest in the body and questions about what qualifies as a body or bodies. Susan Bourdeau traces the evolution of the practice-based female body through Bourdieu and Foucault to arrive at the assertion that, quote, through the organization and regulation of the time, space, and movements of our daily lives, our bodies are trained, shaped, and impressed with the stamp of prevailing historical forms of selfhood, desire, masculinity, femininity, end quote. And that this disciplining of the body is regulated by the pursuit of an ever-changing, homogenizing, elusive ideal of femininity. So through this ongoing process, the corporeality of female flesh is transformed into the docile body of Foucault's conception. And there's kind of a lived tension between the subjecthood of the self and the objectification of this body. Now, in theorizing corporeal feminism a little bit more thoroughly, Grosch writes that, quote, the body is neither brute nor passive, but is interwoven with the constitutive systems of meaning, signification, and representation. So on the one hand, we have this agential, signifying, signified body, and on the other, it's also an object of systems of social coercion, legal inscription, social and economic exchange. So the formulation of appropriate femininity becomes naturalized and reified through embodied practice. The body can be seen as a ground of transformation between phenomenological perception and semiotic understanding. Any distinction between these two is clearly an illusion, right? Butler refutes the distinctness of bodily interiority from the external of the bodily surface. The inside subject and the external object are mutually constituted through practice. The body's always present and not merely the repository for discourse. But for women, this perspective is still deeply imbricated with the sexual. Rebecca Schneider asserts that this chain of embodied meanings is always inextricably bound to the sexual, quote, saying that any body bearing female markings is automatically shadowed by the history of that body's signification, its delimitation as a signifier of sexuality. So what we have now is a new sexual economy, which sees the hypersexual move to the forefront of popular culture. So we see this in the prevalence of sexual imagery invading all aspects of society: high fashion, low culture, athletics, politics, healthcare, publishing, advertising. And whereas this explicit depiction of sex would have gained censure in recent decades, it's now the norm to be surrounded by these images of explicit sex. So Foucault's incitement to discourse seems to have changed to an incitement to performance, if you will. And because a certain appearance of sexiness has become the expected norm for females, this constructed pretense has also become kind of a currency in society. Accordingly, many women spend a lot of time and money to attain this standard. We become the consumers in preparation for being the consumed. But consumption is couched in this rhetoric of empowerment. So female sexuality has become inseparably bound up in this capitalist project. At this point in kind of the greater paper, I traipse around through ideas of the alienation of labor via Marx and the ways that in pursuing ideal sexiness, overexpressing any kind of sexuality, the neo-burlesque performer becomes divorced from identification with the product of her labor. And the sexual body becomes commodity ruling the producer instead of being produced by them. Additionally, I try to make a connection here to Freud's commodity fetishism, and his mapping of the development of a fetish as it's kind of seen through the reveal in the fan dance in Neo-Burlesque, so which is a performance that compartmentalizes the body into glimpses. How are we doing for time? Okay, 5 minutes. Okay. So dealing more directly with this idea of subject and object, I kind of dally around with Hegel's master-slave dialectic a little bit to think about how both are mutually constituted in the encounter. And I make the claim that the ironic subversion of power, which occurs when the slave submits to the master, can also be seen in the conscious self-objectification which characterizes neo-burlesque. So neo-burlesque allows the erotic scenarios of desiring to be desired by others, and even desiring oneself to be explored in a very controlled and safe environment. This element of desire is manifested and manipulated by use of the gaze. Wilson asserts that burlesque is aware of the fact that it treads dangerous ground between reinforcing structures of the gaze and challenging these structures, and it's this knowingness that allows the form to openly question the environment that has produced this structure. So the woman acknowledges her transition to status of the object, and instead of being skewered into this position by the imposition of the gaze, she gives permission to look, rendering the audience a partner in the pleasure of looking instead of an external aggressor. By looking the spectator in the eye and smiling, she's mocking, teasing, challenging the spectator, as well as pleasurably and actively affirming, making a spectacle of herself. She wants to be looked at, passively and vulnerably to succumb to the spectator's power and pleasure, but with this, quote, to be looked atness is married a powerful, questioning, humorous smile and wink, which thwarts and pulverizes the totality of anonymous and aloof control. So the subversion of the piece rests on the combination of satire and sexiness. Obviously, there is a huge counter-argument to this from Mulvey that I get into a little bit more deeply. As well, Rosalind Gill says that she denies that this shift towards self-objectification is free from any prescriptions of male hegemony. In fact, she says, quote, "This shift entails as a move from an external male judging gaze to a self-policing narcissistic gaze." She argues that it represents a higher or deeper form of exploitation than objectification, one in which the objectifying male gaze is internalized to form a new disciplinary regime. Kind of adding some nuance to this idea of sexual currency or capital, we can turn to sexual fields theory. Adam Isaiah Green touches on this a bit. He's a sociologist. Fields refer to particular contexts which inform and delineate attributes of desirability. So in this manner, currency is always relational. In particular, elements such as beauty and sex appeal are always defined within very specific social fields and do not necessarily translate across cultural arenas. Excuse me. So the instability of prized aesthetic attributes, it decreases the emancipatory potential that is supposedly contained in neo-burlesque. So if beauty is inconstant, how can women bank on this currency? So Wilson fails to acknowledge that women's sexual desirability to men accrues unequally across women, and it's embedded, in structures of race and class, and to say nothing of age. Some women are allowed to self-construct as active desiring sexual agents. So it seems we've hit a bit of a dead end as far as subject and object binary goes, right? Flipping doesn't change the binary, it just flips the binary. So in the name of empowerment, even if we're making this move, we're not really breaking free. So what do we do? What do I do? So I'm trying to go back to Grosch and corporeal phenomenology and try to understand the body as both an object and agent of experience. Quote, "It is the condition and context through which I'm able to have a relation to others," end quote. So the body is neither wholly object nor subject because it's implicated in the process of experiential awareness. So the body is, quote, "a phenomenon experienced by me, and thus provides the very horizon and perspectival point which places me in the world and makes relations between me, other objects, and other subjects visible," end quote. Barad gets at this, Haraway gets at this, the idea that everything is bodies and that any boundaries or borders between bodies are completely illusionary. So I think that this theory can be used to kind of figuratively flesh out, if you will, the subject-object binary. So in the case of neo-burlesque, the encounter is not only a psychological negotiation of subject-object positions, but also a mutually affective experience. So when the audience member views the body of the performer and experiences desire or sexual arousal, this is more than a coming to knowledge of oneself. Gross writes that to perceive the other's body as desirable means converting the other's physiology into a set of signs addressed to the subject, reorienting movements, activities, and behaviors with other significances. So the subject perceives the outer surface and behavior of the other in terms of their own inner animations, its vibrant sensitivity. So this notion of permeability, both across bodies, across the interior and exterior of your own body, defies any kind of approach that's narrowly contained with any economic understanding of objectification and commodification. They're too precisely narrowed to be fully useful for understanding the volatile, unbounded, and multiplying, signifying nature of the body. We'll stop there.